Peace and love. Salam and afakir. I'm going to read some excerpts from this book, Africans and Native Americans, The Language of Race and the Evolution of Red Black Peoples, by Jack D. Forbes, who's the former director of Native American Studies at the University of California. I posted a picture of this book on Facebook, and it has received over 1,000 comments, and a lot of the comments are controversial about, from people who do not know what the book is actually about and have assumptions, I guess, by the cover on the book. So I'm going to read some of it, so maybe some people can learn something that they don't know. The part I'm reading is from chapter 10, which is the last chapter of the book. In this book, when he says American, he's referring to indigenous Americans, Native Americans, Aboriginal Americans, whatever term you use. When he uses the term American in this book, he's referring to the people who lived in the Americas, from North, South, the Caribbean, in the Americas, okay? African/American contacts and the modern repeopling of the Americas. African and American contacts in pre-Columbian times. The evidence seems rather convincing that Americans reached the British Isles and the coast of Europe long before 1492, and perhaps as early as 50 BC. The navigational capabilities of Americans, as well as favorable ocean currents, also suggest the possibility of contacts with the Azores and perhaps the Canary Islands and the coast of Africa. I have not examined critically the claims made by others for possible ancient African contacts with America, but the evidence presented herein is suggestive of interaction shortly prior to 1492. The reports of black traders in the Caribbean and of black people living in Panama by 1513 cannot be ignored. Much work remains to be done. The archaeological, ethnological, art, oral, literature, and documentary records must all be examined from Iceland and Ireland to Southern Africa with a view to the discovery of evidence relating to American influences. The task has hardly commenced, since heretofore few scholars have been looking for the effects of American arrivals in either Europe or Africa. Similarly, much work remains in terms of the evidence of African contacts with America. Someone must, for example, trace carefully the history of the black village near Caracua, Panama, after 1513 to shed further light on its origin. Those who also advocate an African presence in ancient America must go beyond pointing out a particular image as having so-called African features, and must proceed to the placing of the image in a complete cultural historical process. If, for example, the giant heads of the Olmec culture were of African inspiration, then we must be shown where in Africa of 800 to 300 BC such heads were also being carved. I have established the high probability also that Americans kidnapped by the Norse reached northern Europe in the 1000s and early 1400s, and the possibility that Americans from Newfoundland and elsewhere may have been taken to Portugal or other parts of Europe in the 1490s or even earlier. Nonetheless, the slave trade initiated by Columbus in the Caribbean and by the Portuguese in Brazil constituted a decisive stage in the escalation of African/American contacts of an intensive nature. American/African contacts in Africa and Europe. The presence of Native Americans in Europe and Africa in significant numbers from the 1490s onwards has been overlooked by the scholarly world and in general. Nonetheless, the subject is very significant indeed because of the tremendous Native American cultural impact upon both continents, especially in the horticultural realm. Now, however, we can demonstrate enough intensity of contact to allow for the diffusion of American techniques, pipe making or cassava production, crops, ideas, individual freedoms, utopian, socialism, folklore, much art, medicine, and so on, not by the same indirect means, but through direct American contact within Europe and Africa. Evidence has been presented in the preceding pages to show that Columbus planned to sell American slaves to the African islands controlled by Spain and Portugal as early as the mid-1490s, and that it is extremely likely that the Portuguese began to use native Brazilians in Africa as early as the first decade of the 16th century. Native American contacts with Africa intensified as Angola and West Africa became ever more entwined with Brazil, and especially with the direct Dutch use of Native American auxiliary troops in the conquest of Angola, Almina, Ghana, and the Portuguese islands of the Gulf of Guinea. We have been able to outline the possible extent of Native American presence in places such as Angola, Ghana, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, and so on, but we have not exhausted the subject. Quite the contrary. It will be necessary for other scholars to conduct detailed, in-depth studies in all the countries mentioned. We can be sure, however, that a new chapter in the social, cultural history of Africa and Europe will be opened once the American presence is acknowledged and further investigated. The clarification of the meanings of color and racial terms. The greater part of this study has been taken up with the extremely crucial task of showing that the modern European and North American tendency to be obsessed with black/white relations to the near exclusion of multi-ethnic and time-deaf comparative perspectives has led to significant distortions in the use of color and racial terms, such as colored, black, Negro, mulatto, musty, pardo, loro, and several others. I have been able to clarify the evolution of many of these terms insofar as they bear upon American/African relations. In general, I am able to show that all of these terms have historically been applicable to persons of American ancestry, and that one cannot read back into previous centuries the current dictionary definitions of such words without serious error. Of considerable significance has been the documentation that Americans were often called Negroes, blacks, Negroes, maroon, in various languages, along with other non-white peoples, and that this is very dangerous to assume that every person referred to as Negro or black was African. This is especially pertinent to analyses relating to the character of slaves being shipped from or within the Americas. Also of great significance has been our showing that mulatto in several languages included persons of half or part American ancestry, and that in the Spanish colonies in the Americas, most mulattoes in the 16th and 17th centuries were of American/African background, not European African. Generally speaking, it would seem that mulatto referred to a person who was part African and part not African, but in French and North American colonial English, and mulatto could refer to a European American mixed blood. This was also true of mulat in Dutch. The evidence also shows that Native Americans were commonly referred to as people of color, or it is equivalent in various languages. This is of great significance for the social history of the United States, Brazil, Argentina, and the Americas in general, since it has often been assumed by English-speaking scholars, especially that of people of color in the United States or Pardos in Brazil, should be regarded as Negroes or people of black identity. It has been shown that it is historically unsound to ignore the possible American ancestry of people referred to in sources as colored, Pardos, and so on. This is also true of people called mulattoes, as discussed above. The collective significance of these findings consists principally in their creating an absolute obligation for the radical revision of our views relative to the nature of the modern post-1500 repeopling of the Americas. In addition, however, these findings require that a new critical look be taken at some of the most common notions current regarding the history of race relations, slavery, the evolution of plantation societies, and the development of free colored populations in the Americas. The evolution of racism and caste terminology. As the reader will recall, most Europeans from the 1200s through the early 1500s utilized terms such as Negro, Loro, Pardo, Olavaste, and Beretino to refer to persons of intermediate, and dark color shades. These terms were then supplemented by proliferation of others such as Leonardo, Membrilo, Cocado, Moreno, Troquino. The significant thing about these terms is that it would appear that they were not used as a race or caste names. They were not used in a genealogical sense, nor did they point towards anything more than an appearance, generally speaking. In 1552, the Historia of Francisco Lopez de Gomara appeared, and within it, the author included an interesting statement about human physical variation. In it, he remarked upon the marvelous variety of colors created by God for human beings, and how although whites and blacks seem to be totally opposite colors, there is really a progression of colors almost by grades. There are whites and many shades of white, of many degrees of redness, and blacks of many kinds of blackness. Moreover, from white to Bamillo, one moves through Discolorado and Rubio, and from black one moves through ash-colored Moreno, Loro, and Leonardo. The Native Americans are Leonardo or General Membralos, Cochos, stewed quince color, yellowish, or Constanos, chestnut, according to Lopez. The perspective of Lopez is seeing a great variety of colors not associated with any concept of separate races is significant, and I believe typical of most observers prior to modern times. Especially in the Mediterranean world, we have noted that the use of a great variety of color terms and awareness of many gradations in human physical types. In some, I think that we can say that the general view was that human types changed gradually and blended into one another. Moreover, I believe that we can assert that it was more important for the Iberians, at least, that a person was a Muslim and an Arab or Berber than he was black, brown, or white in color, or that his hair was kinky or curly or straight. In Europe itself, most of the non-whites who arrived prior to the current century were gradually absorbed into the general populations, and thus a racial caste system failed to evolve locally. But in the European colonies, as has been pointed out, a fundamental shift occurred, coincident with the adoption of terms such as mestizo and mulatto, and with the conquest or control of large masses of Americans, Africans, and Asians. As noted in this study, the evolution of the term mestizo or hybrid seems to reflect a very significant shift in Europeans' thinking. a shift in direction of the racism. Hybrid formerly referred to almost any type of mixture, including that between wild and tame or between citizen and stranger. Mestizo commenced its history as an equivalent of hybrid and originally was applicable to animals as well as humans and to mixture that was religious, ethnic, or cultural as well as racial. But gradually European colonists began to place greater and greater emphasis upon a narrow concept of mestizo, which began to upset that balance between cultural and biological factors. The Spanish and Portuguese varieties of colonialism never abandoned cultural factors completely. For example, differentiating between mestizos of legitimate birth or ones raised among Spaniards and mestizos raised among Americans. British North American colonialists followed at first the same path, differentiating in some colonies between mulattoes born of a white mother and those born of American or African mothers, for example. But in the 19th century, and especially after the U.S. Civil War, greater and greater emphasis was placed upon wholly biological or racial characterization and differentiation in North America. Generally speaking, a study of colonial legislation reveals that terms such as Prieto, Mestizo, Mulatto, Zambago, Musty, and so on were utilized largely to exclude. From the early 1500s onward, as we can trace a whole series of laws in the various empires in which the rights extended to Spaniards, Portuguese, Britons, and other white persons were denied to persons categorized as Negroes, mulattoes, blacks, musties, mestizos, and so forth. The primary use of such terms in legislation was to exclude persons so categorized from the ordinary rights and privileges enjoyed by white subjects of the respective colonial powers. Of course, it is true that the terms themselves did not originally cause this exclusion. Exclusion resulted from the social reality of colonial exploitation. The Spaniards, instead of denying to mulattoes the right to wear expensive jewelry and silk clothes, could have simply said that any woman of African and Spanish or African and American / Indian ancestry could not wear such items. Terms such as mulatta were simply shorthand, efficient ways for referring to certain kinds of people without describing them in detail. On the other hand, it is also true that once developed, such terms as Negro, mulatto, Indian, and half-breed came to possess a power of their own, facilitating the stereotyping of people. Moreover, as racism developed as a cancer in European colonial settings, this stereotyping came to have a greater and greater racial as opposed to cultural content, especially in North America. The repeopling of the Americas. Racial stereotyping, as well as the use of caste categories fostered by colonialism, have had the effect of distorting our understanding of the repeopling of the Americas. I have provided a critical and theoretical basis upon which a new approach to the subject can be erected. A basis informed by empirical examination of the evidence relating to the meaning of ethnic terms in given spatial or temporal realms, as opposed to simply making deductive assumptions based upon myths of the recent past or of the present. One of the major tasks now is to clarify the nature of the repeopling of the Americas, that is, the population recovery which followed the declines of the 16th century or subsequent centuries, depending on the area. The centuries which followed Columbus's excursion into the Caribbean saw a radical decline in the population of the Americas, as has been pointed out earlier. Subsequently, the population began to recover, but with important differences. That in many areas, the subsequent population has seemed to be African or mixed European in appearance rather than Native American. Many scholars have assumed that the repopulation process, particularly the circum-Caribbean region, was one of replacement of the Americans by Africans and African slash European mixed bloods. This is the common picture provided for the repeopling of the Caribbean islands, the southern United States, and parts of coastal mainland South America. My research establishes beyond any doubt that the above picture is erroneous. There has essentially been no replacement of Native Americans considered on a broad scale. What has in fact happened is that American survivors and African survivors, because of huge numbers of Africans also died in the process, have merged together to create the basic modern populations of much of the greater Caribbean and adjacent mainland regions. Of course, as the years have passed, the process of merger has proven to be uneven. Some areas, such as Mexico and Peru, have become phenotypically Indian, while other areas, such as many of the islands, have become phenotypically African. In general, of course, one finds a wide range of subgroups since merger has been uneven and European and Asian genes have also been absorbed. In simplistic terms, nonetheless, we can suggest the broad significance of American/African intermixture by referring to the European Neo/American mixed population and the Western Neo/American mixed population. Both groups have arisen or are arising from the mixture of African, American, European, and some Asian elements, with the American element being relatively stronger in Eastern Neo/American, and the Native American element being relatively stronger in the Western Neo/American, as discussed at the close of chapter 2. In short, persons may look African but have Native American ancestry, or look Indigenous American but have African ancestry. And not only may individuals lean in one direction or the other, but the population of entire regions may seem to fall into one category or the other. But by the 19th century, it seems quite certain that Afro-Americans, whether living in Latin America, the Caribbean, or in North America, had absorbed considerable amounts of Native American ancestry. Similarly, many North American and circum-Caribbean native groups had absorbed varying amounts of African ancestry, from New England to the entire rim of Central and South America. But in many cases, we are dealing with 3 to 400 years, 20 generations of intermixture of a very complex sort. Very seldom would we be looking at, for example, a half American, half African person to the later 19th century, but rather at a person both of whose parents might have varying amounts of African and American ancestry derived at different intervals and from extremely diverse sources, as from American nations as different as the Narragansett or Pequot and the Carib or Arawak, or from African nations as diverse as the Mandinka, Yoruba, and Malagasy. The ancestry of modern-day Americans, rather of Black or Indian appearance, is often or usually quite complex indeed. It is sad that so many such persons have been forced by racism into arbitrary categories which tend to render their ethnic heritage simple rather than complex. It is now one of the principal tasks of scholarship to replace the shallow, one-dimensional images of non-whites with more accurate multi-dimensional portraits. God bless you, Jack Forbes. He wrote this before DNA testing. God bless this man, because I have African, European, Native American, and Asian ancestry. God bless you, Jack Forbes. You should read this book. Instead of assuming what a book is by its cover, you have to read the context of the book, the content. This is a deep book. You can learn a lot from it if you actually read it. Peace and love.